original title of my presentation, and I've added this parenthesis to it, thoughts on. When I first thought of this presentation and of this workshop, I kind of hoped to be a bit more done with my thinking about the site and with processing of all the data and so on, but of course things usually take longer and become more complicated than initially believed. So it's a pretty roughly polished lump of coal rather than a diamond. But that also makes it kind of a good thing to discuss during this workshop, because everything in this presentation is actually open for interpretation, reinterpretation, discussion about whether there is more work that could be added to this. And I'm going to present to you an analysis of the site of Sunnevis, which could be described as maybe a typical Danish early Iron Age site, although what is really typical? We have heard from Niels quite a lot about the nature of these sites already, so I won't go into detail with that. And I'm going to mostly talk about what I have called the focus area, which is this part of the site, where there were also two areas that were sampled in the late 2000s, so 2006-07, I think, for phosphate analysis with lots of samples being collected, and we have used some of those samples for this analysis. And you can see here, just a typical house on this site, and I think you're all familiar with the concept. So it's a so-called buyer house, so which is supposed to have a buyer in one half and a living space in the other, and there are some traces of the animal booths over here. And then I'm also going to make some comparisons to a roughly contemporaneous site at Vestergaard. It's probably slightly younger, just to show some variation of what is in this area for this general period. So I'm working on a postdoc project, and my entry to it is through archaeobotany. It's archaeobotany, which I have been performing at the University of Umeå, and because archaeobotanical analysis is often quite complicated, we often deal with situations of equi and multifinality, many different reasons for an observed pattern. I started to, over the last years, to work more closer with one of my colleagues, Johan Linderholm, who is our soil scientist and who has been working a lot with phosphate analysis. And then as I was presenting some of that work, we were repeatedly told by our excavating colleagues that these kind of analyses need to be more closely connected with the rest of archaeology. So this project kind of aims to explore these connections and hopefully maybe result in some ideas for how to improve how we sample and think about these things. So a little bit, actually, how do we turn multidisciplinary, so the looking of settlements, the parallel study of settlement of the same phenomenon into a more coherent whole. And I've already mentioned the biographical concepts, that they actually provide quite a useful framework for thinking about the complexity of settlements. Colin has shown us a lot about how spaces can change in use and so on, so we need to take that into our process. But as I was thinking and reading about this, I also came really attached to this part of Kopitov's article, the original article about the cultural biography of things, where he wrote that a more theoretically aware biographical model is rather more demanding. It is based on a reasonable number of actual life stories, and it presents the range of possibilities that the society in question offers and examines the manner in which these possibilities are realized. And it examines idealized biographies that were considered to be desirable and the way real-life departures from models are perceived. And this is what he wrote about people, continuing that in doing the biography of things, you can ask more or less the same questions. What is an ideal career for a thing, which in this case is a house or a settlement? And to what extent is it allowed to actually deviate from it? And maybe that span of possibilities that is also really the interesting thing about a society that leaves these houses behind. And yeah, finishing that biographies of things can make salient what might otherwise remain obscure. So on this case study, I've been kind of trying to test this idea of a biographical interdisciplinary approach, which would acknowledge that houses and settlements were not static, but rather in constant flux and undergoing numerous life stages. That it also acknowledges that both functional and social cultural factors in its explanation of the studied phenomena, and that aims to kind of define an idealized career for a settlement and then study in which way it may or may not have deviated from that ideal. And in this spirit, you could then ask questions inspired by Kopitov's thoughts that would go something like, how was a settlement or house constructed, and what markers of its intended use does it bear? How was this intention realized in practice? Can an idealized career for the house or settlement be seen in its construction? What activities can be inferred as occurring during the use phases of the settlements? Are there signs of modification or of changing activities? Does the house or settlement appear to have undergone different life stages? And how was the house or settlement abandoned? And these are, of course, very complex questions, and I don't have any illusions that we can answer all of them on this site, but they could at least be kind of background questions that we can bring with us when looking at the data that we get. And then, of course, in a project aiming at developing methodological combinations, these questions will be accompanied by what methods and perspectives must be combined in order to acquire the relevant data for this kind of exploration of a settlement. And how do we organize sequences of projects with integrated methodologies in such a way that they, over time, provide us with this understanding of the span of possibilities that a house type or a settlement type could have taken. And I'm thinking that this kind of approach could be used not only just for approaching settlements holistically, but maybe also for selected phenomena. So Maria has been working a lot with animal keeping in Sweden. So what kind of possibilities were created on settlements for animal keeping, and what kind of traces do we have of how these possibilities were lived out? So then I've been thinking about the different available approaches that we have kind of in our core toolkit of South Scandinavian archaeology. And of course, there are new methods being introduced, but I think on the whole, we have really three groups of evidence available to us. We have, of course, all our techniques of studying architecture and settlement structure, so the phasing of settlements, modification of houses, kind of the skeleton, the architectural skeleton of a settlement, and the playing field where activities took place. Then we have all the various types of settlement activity residues, which can, as we just saw in Karen's presentation, be very complex. But yeah, traditionally consist of traces of floor layers, artifact distributions, phosphates in houses, and so on. And then, of course, we also have a tradition of middle range work, so ethnographic studies specifically targeted for allowing for interpretation of archaeological data, and also experimental work. Archaeobotany, I think, is a really good example where most of the modern research is underpinned by very solid experimental work in the past. Right, and there's one quote that I think is quite relevant by Leo Webley, who stresses that while architecture may inform us of ideals of how space should be used, it does not directly tell us anything about how it was actually used in the course of people's daily life. And the challenge is to gain an understanding of houses, which balances the structural aspects of the role of the house within a social and ideological system with agency, contingency, and micro-level variation. So here we're actually talking about researchers approaching settlements from quite different perspectives. People like Karen looking at the details, but then also the big architecture structure. And yeah, of course, there are also landscape and environmental perspectives you could bring into that, but I haven't thought of that at all, just because of time constraints. So I'm thinking that maybe a potential exploration of settlements in the South Scandinavian prehistory, actually, could look something like this, where we're trying to look at individual sites and try to do what I just described. So see if we can see an intention for certain activities, and then look for traces how these intentions could have played out in the real life. And they would require, really, these three approaches. They would require a thorough understanding of the architecture and the structure of the settlement in order to select where we apply our very detailed analyses. And these, in turn, often require a middle-range framework to kind of attach it to some form of observed reality. And then, of course, if we, over a longer time, would like to add case studies into a more general model that explores the possibilities for certain activities, or the biographical possibilities of settlements, we would need to, well, first of all, always evaluate and improve our methodologies, because each case study would point out our flaws, and then we would need to rethink and retry. But then also slowly adding data into a more general model. And I've tried to visualize this just to kind of see how this could look over a period of maybe 10 years of research with a group of people jointly thinking about how to join their efforts. So, trying to combine these different lines of evidence, I have done several things on the material that I got from Sonaris via Nils. And the first one is to study the settlement structure, and I've done this with a technique that was developed by the Dutch archaeologist Stein Arnoldsen called VASO, so Visual Analysis of Spatial Overlays, which consists basically of making a simplified plan of the settlement. So you can see here the general site plan slowly being simplified down to condense the key components. And then you select an arbitrary space and create an individual plan, for example, for each of your longhouses. And these can later on be digitally put on top of each other and moved and rotated and used in a qualitative search for recurrent patterns, something that he has shown here, right? So we have a site with overlapping habitation, but actually when we rotate the different components, we can see that there is a rule for the placement of these things. In this case, outbuilding situated right hand of the westmost entrance. Settlement activity residues. Here I have just used the standard method that is used in the environmental archaeology lab in Umeå, which consists, we usually don't look too much at micro and macro artifacts, but we're doing it in this case. The parts that are gray are parts that I'm not going to mention today because it would take too long. I've done a plant macrofossil analysis of the carbonized remains. And we've also performed a phosphate analysis with the citric acid extraction method. And this is work that is, so this analysis is based on the work of one of my colleagues, Johan Linderholm, who always performs this analysis as a two-step process. Before ignition in an oven, which gives a reading that he calls CIT-P, and is said to be an estimate of inorganically bound phosphate. After ignition, which gives an estimate of total phosphate, which allows then for an estimate of the organically bound fraction by subtraction. And these two measurements can also be recalculated into something called a phosphate quota, where a high quota indicates more organic phosphate and a low quota indicates more inorganic phosphate. And then the kind of traditional interpretation of this in commercial archaeology, at least, have been that there are certain materials on settlements that have more likelihood of generating phosphate signals because they are handled in large volumes. And for organic phosphate, that would be plant matter, crop residues, and so on, including dung from animals. And inorganically bound phosphate, which would probably derive from bones or animal refuse, and oxidized plant matters, so ash. And then we've also performed an analysis of the organic content of the soil and magnetic susceptibility. And then just to show that there is some use of using these kind of middle range frameworks, I used the work of Lennart Kauli, who has, for the purpose of understanding Iron Age settlements, studied the settlement, historical settlement records from the 18th century Holland, and compiled very detailed lists of how much space each individual household needs for certain agricultural activities. And he calculates that for 5 months of stalling, so stalling over the winter months, a household would require 50 square meters just for the storage of fodder if it had 1 horse, 5 cattle, and a couple pigs and sheep, which, together with the other requirements, would mean that a household needs 150 square meters on top of the byre and the living area. And then, of course, this increases with the amount of animals. So this is kind of the preliminary results that we've been getting. I won't go too much into architecture. These houses seem mostly single-phased, except that at Vestergaard there are traces of rebuilding and modification. I think, oh wait. So these arrows point out actually, here the 2 wall trenches, so this wall at least was rebuilt, and also these animal booths, they're only 30 centimeters apart, so it's actually most likely 2 phases of animal booths superimposed on top of each other. And you can also see that these 2 house sites are almost identical. And there are no animal booths in these 2 houses. And sometimes it's argued that buyers, that houses without animal booths can still indicate buyer spaces by a tighter placement of post holes, which would make these 2 houses a little bit odd, because then we would have the stable in the western part and not the eastern, so they would actually be mirrored, but yeah, just leave it. So what we see is actually a consistency in longhouse design, but quite a lot of difference in the amount of space that is created for animals. So from 8 animals in the smallest, in some of the houses, to 16 in the biggest one. And then I've done the VASO analysis on the focus area and prepared the VASO analysis for the rest of the site. And just to show you that there are actually recurrent pattern, these are some of the house sites that are on the site, and you can see here longhouse 2 and 5, and if we superimpose them on top of each other, they look like this, and 12 and 8 look like this, except that number 12 has a little building associated to the south, and the other one to the north. This is not as unproblematic as it looks on this map, because not everything was excavated, so these are just hypotheses. But it gives us some idea of the extent of the house sites, which could have looked something like this, and that there were 2 to 3 smaller buildings associated with each longhouse, and they were all roughly of this size, which, if we think about the extent of the sampling grids for the geochemistry, already shows us that there is some problem here, that we're probably only looking at a fragment of a house site and not the entire house site. So then if we look at the phosphate analysis, I've changed these maps a little bit, by the way. I think this actually shows the data better than the interpolated maps. So very quickly, the estimate of the inorganic phosphate show higher levels to the south of the main axis of the house, but also higher values around pits and in association to houses. And then the total phosphate estimate shows something completely different, and I think this becomes clearer when we look at the phosphate quota, which shows all the high values kind of behind this outbuilding, and then a few in between. And when we zoom into the house and look at the plants, we also see something that is maybe not immediately expected. We would expect plant concentrations around the hearths. If we imagine we have a situation like this. But actually, in this case, almost all of the carbonized plants were found in what is supposed to be the bio part of the house. And we also have higher concentrations of charcoal here. And this, could be explained away as maybe some random disturbance and so on, but we will see that this is actually a recurrent pattern. But first, on this house site, we again see phosphate concentrations, and they are associated with houses. Not so much in the houses themselves, but actually more around. And I think the phosphate quota here is very interesting, because even if we remove the houses, we see that there is an altered ratio between these two fractions, which is not evident in the total values. And this is something that Johan Linderholm often points out, that it's not always the high phosphate values that are important, but the alteration of them under certain circumstances. But yeah, compared to house 2, we're looking at a much smaller space, and if we assume that these house sites were actually much bigger, we're probably missing a big part of the picture. And then the plant remains. There were many, many more on this house site, 30 times higher concentrations, but actually the pattern that they show is very similar. And here we also had a lot of finds of these little molten balls of sediment, which are very often mentioned in archaeobotanical reports, but I think haven't really been studied that well, and it's, I think, something that should be done in the future. But they show a very similar pattern to the plants. So when I wrote this paper, I kind of interpreted this that maybe we're actually looking at a primary space with a half, right? Accounting, for example, for these finds of the molten fragments. And then a refuse space or a waste management space. And then movement out of this material out of the house, which in that case would correspond quite well with the phosphate analysis results. But having listened to Karen now, I'm also thinking that this is mostly ash. These are macrofossils that would have come together with ash. So actually, it could be that this material is consciously being moved to the bier for dampening odors or whatever else. And then finally, comparison with the framework that Cardi set up shows us that even if these houses were actually intended to carry this many animals, they would not have been stalled intensively over a whole winter. So his numbers are for 5 months of stalling from November to April, I think, something like that. And we can see here that even if we assume the existence of a loft in these longhouses, none of them can actually store enough fodder to keep the animals close to the house for very intensive stalling. So we're probably maybe looking at a seasonal kind of variation or a daily movement of the animals. Maybe they're only collected in the bier on specific occasions. Right, so summary. We have quite different house site layouts during this rough period of the early Iron Age, but quite similar distribution of space between small and large houses. So maybe this does reflect some kind of proper way of dividing space into components. And then within each studied area, we have a consistency of house design, house site design. And so both at Vestergaard and at Sunneris, there seems to be a recurring way of arranging the houses, but between those house sites, they're actually quite different. So maybe we're looking at generations kind of repeating the farmyard of the previous one. The standard ways of constructing the log house that goes for the whole of the northern European area for this period. But we also have the plant macrofossil analysis that whatever was going on inside the house, at least in these two cases, seems to have been quite similar. The concentrations of plants are quite different, but they show the same pattern. And now we have 2 more houses that are being analyzed right now, so it will be really interesting to see if those 2 also show the same pattern. Houses were built to house 8 to 16 animals, but not to store enough fodder for long-term stalling. That would be the conclusion from this kind of middle-range comparison. Stalling as an intermittent activity that maybe was also conducted to a large extent outdoors. And if you think about it, yeah, in terms of this model of working, I think we could now think about, so how would we improve it? And I think my dream scenario would be that it would be improved, but by a team of people looking at developing even better historical and ethnographic frameworks for understanding archaeological data, working more with the specific methods that we're using to trace certain things, and maybe more sophisticated methods of settlement structure analysis. And that would mean at least 3 to 5 researchers or research groups working together, which requires, a lot of coordination, a lot of talking, a lot of understanding of these problems and agreeing upon what needs to be done. And that is kind of the background for why I decided to contribute to this workshop. Thank you.